"Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong line." Cassandra looked up. A wealthy businessman stood in front of her, arms crossed, eyes full of doubt. "This line is for first-class passengers," he added, his voice dripping with condescension. But seconds later, he turned pale when he realized who she was. Watch till the end to see his shocking reaction. The announcement echoed through the terminal, blending into the steady hum of travelers moving past one another. The business-class check-in area exuded an air of quiet sophistication: plush red carpets, leather seats, and passengers draped in expensive fabrics, carrying themselves with the effortless ease of privilege. Cassie Bennett stepped into the airport, her movements unhurried yet assured. At 60, she still possessed a kind of understated elegance. No need for grand gestures, no need to prove anything. A soft lavender silk scarf rested against her collarbone, complementing the crisp white blouse and tailored black slacks she wore with quiet confidence. In her hand was a business-class ticket, a gift from her son, David Sterling, CEO of Sterling Airways. Cassie paused in front of the departure screen, her gaze scanning the lines of text until she found it. Sterling Airways 202, Seat 2A. Business class, an experience not granted to just anyone. A faint smile touched her lips as she thought of her son. David had seen, time and time again, the ways the world had dismissed his mother, and now he had risen high enough to change how the world saw people like them. She adjusted her grip on the handle of her suitcase and made her way to the business class counter, her steps steady, neither hurried nor hesitant. The check-in agent, a young woman with a polished, professional smile, took her ticket and swiftly entered the details into the system. Cassie stood still, waiting, unaware that a pair of eyes had locked onto her. Then, a voice, low, firm, broke through the air, cutting through the quiet efficiency of the check-in area. "There must be some mistake. Business class isn't for people like her." Cassie didn't turn immediately. She let the words hang in the space between them, weighing their worth, deciding whether they were even worth acknowledging. Then, slowly, she turned. Richard Collins, a middle-aged white man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, a Rolex gleaming on his wrist, stood there, his expression composed, but his eyes carrying the quiet conviction of someone who believed he had the right to say what he just said. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. But the words alone were enough. Cassie's face remained unchanged. She didn't argue. She didn't justify. Instead, she simply slid her ticket forward, letting the truth speak for itself. The check-in agent hesitated briefly, then resumed typing. A short silence settled over them. Cassie stood her ground, unmoved, because she had lived this moment before. And she knew this story was far from over. The space around Cassie seemed to pause for a beat as she placed her ticket on the check-in counter. The feeling wasn't unfamiliar. She had lived through this moment too many times before. Yet, no matter how often it happened, there was always a faint bitterness that crept into her chest. The check-in agent, a young woman with neatly tied blonde hair, hesitated briefly before typing the details into the system. The airport buzzed around them, the rolling of suitcase wheels, the low murmur of conversations, but Cassie felt it. A different kind of attention, sharp and assessing, fixed on her. Richard Collins, a white man in his mid-50s, stood just behind her. His tailored charcoal gray suit, the gleaming Rolex on his wrist. Everything about him spoke of wealth and success. But his eyes told a different story. Not crude surprise, but measured doubt, like he had just spotted a piece of the puzzle that didn't belong. His gaze traveled over Cassie, taking in every detail: the soft lavender silk scarf, the polished brown leather shoes, the quiet confidence in her posture. None of it fit the image he believed a business-class passenger should have. Richard stepped forward, his voice low and firm, carrying the authority of a man used to being heard. There must be some mistake. Business class isn't for people like her. The words dropped into the air like ink spilling into clear water. Cassie didn't turn right away. She let the statement hang, untouched, as if weighing whether it deserved her attention at all. Then, slowly, she turned her head, her gaze calm but piercing. Richard didn't blink, but the certainty in his eyes wavered, just slightly. Cassie didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply pushed her ticket forward, her voice steady. "Check for me." No protest, no justification. Just the truth, standing on its own. The check-in agent hesitated, then resumed typing. The screen flickered for a moment before the answer appeared. "Mrs. Bennett has a valid business class ticket. She is booked on Sterling Airways 202, seat 2A. A simple sentence. But to Richard, it landed like a hammer. His expression darkened. But he didn't step back. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, his tone firm. "I'm a loyal customer of this airline. I have the right to ensure my seat isn't misallocated." He wasn't speaking to Cassie. He was speaking to the check-in agent, trying to restore order the way he believed it should be. Around them, other passengers began to take notice. A middle-aged man in glasses frowned slightly. A young woman in business attire turned to her colleague, whispering, but the check-in agent held her ground. "Mr. Collins, there is no mistake. Mrs. Bennett is a business-class passenger." Richard clenched his jaw, a silent sign of dissatisfaction, restrained by decorum. But he wasn't done yet. "Call the manager. I want to verify the VIP list." Cassie's expression didn't change. No raised brow, no sigh of exasperation. She had seen this before, too many times. She knew men like Richard Collins. They didn't shout. They didn't spew outright slurs, but they never truly believed that someone like her could belong here. She could feel the weight of the eyes around her, some watching in quiet curiosity, some recognizing the moment for what it was, but choosing silence. This wasn't over. The business class check-in area was usually calm, but the atmosphere had grown noticeably tense. The check-in agent maintained her professional demeanor, though a flicker of unease crossed her eyes. Cassie remained still, her composure unchanged. Richard, however, was different. Richard Collins, a middle-aged businessman in an expensive suit, stood with his arms crossed over his chest. He could not, would not, accept that someone like Cassie was standing as his equal in this space. "There must be a mistake. I want the VIP list checked again," he said, his tone laced with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The check-in agent didn't waver. "Sir, I've already checked. The information is correct." Richard narrowed his eyes, displeased. "I've flown with this airline for years. I know the process. If you can't handle this, I want to speak to a manager." Cassie remained silent, watching him with sharp yet emotionless eyes. Nearby passengers had started to take notice. No one spoke, but the air had thickened with quiet tension. A man in a management uniform approached. His name tag read, Jonathan Reed, check-in supervisor. He took in the scene, his expression calm as he addressed the group. "Is there a problem?" The check-in agent quickly summarized the situation. Jonathan glanced at the system, his fingers tapping the keyboard. It took Him less than 5 seconds to confirm. Mrs. Bennett has a valid business class ticket. Sterling Airways 202, seat 2A. A simple statement. But it shattered whatever excuse Richard had been clinging to. His face darkened. I'm a loyal customer. I don't think we should have mistakes in the business class roster. Jonathan remained professional. There is no mistake, sir. If you have concerns about our policy, I'd be happy to address them. Richard clenched his jaw, his fingers tapping impatiently against his sleeve, an unmistakable sign of frustration. Then, turning to Cassie, he let out a low, mocking chuckle. You must have some connections in the industry. Cassie tilted her head slightly but said nothing. She simply picked up her ticket from the counter and slipped it into her purse. No rebuttal, no explanation. And that was what infuriated Richard the most. A deep voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Richard turned, certain he had found an ally. But the moment he saw who had spoken, his expression faltered. David Sterling had arrived. The business class check-in area was still taut with tension, like a wire pulled too tight. Richard Collins stood rigid at the counter, his face heavy with frustration. He couldn't believe he was being denied. Him, a longtime customer, Abati, successful businessman. Cassie remained exactly where she was, calm, unmoved. No argument, no rebuttal. Her silence was the strongest statement of all. Jonathan Reed, the check-in supervisor, kept his professional stance, but there was a new steeliness in his gaze. This should have been over by now, if not for the fact that Richard simply could not accept the truth. And then a voice cut through the air, deep, steady, and unmistakably authoritative. Is there a problem here? David Sterling stepped in. For a brief moment, the air seemed to shift, the tension momentarily displaced. But then it returned, just in a different way. David Sterling, CEO of Sterling Airways, walked into the check-in area with an unmistakable presence. His tailored black suit was sharp, yet understated. His navy blue tie neatly knotted. His shoes gleamed, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that signified quiet precision. He didn't need to announce his authority. His presence alone commanded it. Airport staff recognized him immediately. A few straightened their posture. Some gave small, respectful nods. One of the most powerful men in the aviation industry had just walked in. But David's attention was fixed on only one thing. His eyes scanned the situation in seconds, taking in every detail. Then, his gaze landed on Cassie, his mother. And finally, he turned to Richard. The moment Richard saw David, relief flickered across his face, like a drowning man spotting a lifeline. To him, a man in a crisp, commanding suit had to be someone who understood his frustration. Richard allowed himself a small, knowing smile, the smile of a man who believed he had just found an ally. "Ah, I'm glad you're here," Richard began, his tone noticeably lighter. "It seems there's been some confusion with the business class roster. I just wanted to make sure the check-in process is being handled properly." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. A subtle, conspiratorial gesture, as if he and David were on the same side. To Richard, David was the decision-maker here, and surely he would see things his way. David didn't rush to respond. He simply looked at Richard, a gaze calm, unreadable, but carrying the weight of something unspoken. The silence didn't last long, just enough for Richard to sense that something was off. No approving nod, no silent reassurance, nothing that Richard had expected, just a gaze that lingered, long enough to make him shift uneasily. Then David spoke, his words deliberate, each syllable landing with quiet precision. "I understand your confusion." For a split second, Richard felt relief. But then David continued, "But actually, she's not just a business-class passenger." The air around them seemed to tighten. Everything stilled. Few employees exchanged quiet glances. A few passengers slowed their steps, as if sensing something about to unfold. Richard's brow furrowed, unease creeping in. And then David met his gaze, no hesitation left. "She's my mother." The moment froze the entire check-in area. No one spoke, no keyboards clicking, no suitcase wheels rolling, just a thick, suffocating silence that stretched long enough to turn a single second into something unforgettable. Richard didn't move. His entire body stiffened. His eyes widened. Not in shock, but in something far worse. Not just because David Sterling was Cassie's son, but because everything Richard had believed in, everything he thought he understood about the way the world worked, had just unraveled in a single sentence. Cassie remained still, her expression unchanged, as if she had known this moment was coming all along. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at Richard, waiting to see what he would do now. But there was nothing Richard could do, because for the first time in his life, he was the one who no longer belonged in his own story. David Sterling's words, "She's my mother," still lingered in the air, reverberating like a bell that had shattered everything Richard Collins once believed. The business class check-in area felt frozen in time. No one spoke. No one moved. Every pair of eyes turned to Richard. Strangers, passengers, airport staff, people Richard had never given a second thought, were now looking at him differently. He stood motionless, his eyes wide in absolute shock. His face burned red, though it was impossible to tell whether it was from embarrassment or anger. His jaw twitched, a telltale sign of a man forcing himself to swallow a truth too bitter to accept. Just moments ago, he had been so certain of his position, so sure of his authority, so convinced that a woman like Cassie Bennett did not belong. Here, now, he was the one who didn't belong. No one spoke at first, but then the whispers started. A young white woman in a sleek business suit leaned toward her colleague and murmured, "Oh my God, he did not see that coming." A few steps away, a middle-aged black man stood with his arms crossed. He didn't say a word, but the disappointment on his face was unmistakable. And then, a voice from the back, laced with barely contained excitement. A young man, no older than 20, holding up his phone, recording. "This is gonna be all over Twitter in 5 minutes." No one laughed outright. But there were glances exchanged, flickers of knowing smiles. And Richard knew. He could feel it. The shift in the air. The way people weren't just looking at him as a man who had been wrong, but as a man who was now pitiful. Cassie never turned to face him. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to say a word. With quiet grace, she simply reached for her ticket from the counter and offered the check-in agent a polite nod, her voice calm. "Thank you." Jonathan Reed, the check-in supervisor, had stepped aside. His posture was still professional, but his gaze had softened when he looked at Cassie. "You're all set for boarding, Mrs. Bennett." Cassie nodded, graceful, unrushed, unshaken. She was ready to leave. Richard wanted to say something, but he couldn't. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. There was so much he wanted to say. A defense, an excuse, something to salvage, the image he had lost in mere minutes. But nothing would be right in this moment. His entire body felt rigid, as though he had never experienced a moment so completely out of his control. Cassie walked away, her posture poised, her steps unwavering. She didn't need to win, because she had never been losing, and Richard knew this moment would never leave him. Cassie walked forward, her posture straight, her steps steady, yet unhurried. The business class check-in area remained cloaked in the heavy silence Richard Collins had left behind. Curious eyes still followed her, but they were no longer filled with doubt or quiet judgment. Now they held something else: recognition, respect. Richard remained frozen at the counter. He couldn't bring himself to walk away just yet. Something held him in place, something deeper than pride, heavier than mere frustration. Because leaving now would mean acknowledging it. And the worst part wasn't that he had been wrong. It was knowing that no matter how much he wished, there was no going back to undo it. But Cassie had never needed his acknowledgement. She never had. She and David moved toward the business class boarding gate, where warm golden lights reflected off the polished floors. The space was quieter here, filled only with those who belonged, passengers accustomed to privilege, to the kind of priority others could only look up to. But Cassie didn't feel small in this space. She didn't need to prove that she belonged, because she always had. A young airline employee, a bright-eyed man with an easy smile, stood at the boarding gate, scanning tickets. The moment Cassie approached, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of quiet understanding. He gave a small, respectful nod, his voice sincere. "Have a wonderful flight, Mrs. Bennett." Cassie paused for just a moment, a brief second, long enough to matter. She met the young man's gaze, then smiled. Not just politely, but with quiet, unshakable strength. "Thank you. I intend to." The employee smiled back. Not out of obligation, not out of customer service, but because he understood. Cassie turned toward the jet bridge, and then, just before stepping through, she stopped. She didn't turn right away, but she knew. Richard was still standing there, still trapped between humiliation, confusion, and a dawning awareness he didn't yet know how to face. Finally, she looked back at him, not with anger, not with contempt, just a clear, steady gaze. One that held a message she didn't need to say aloud. "I don't need your validation. I belong here." Richard didn't react. A part of him wanted to turn away, to pretend none of this had happened. But another part of him, one he wasn't ready to face, knew that he had to stand in this moment. That, for the first time in his life, he was the one who didn't belong. Cassie didn't wait for an answer. She turned away, stepping through the boarding gate, leaving Richard alone with the weight of his own silence. No one around him spoke. No one whispered. No one pointed. Because they didn't need to. Richard's silence was judgment enough. The aircraft doors stood open, welcoming Cassie into the world of business class, where spacious seats awaited, a chilled glass of champagne rested on a polished tray, and luxury wrapped itself around every detail. But Cassie didn't enter with hesitation. She didn't enter with awe. She stepped inside like someone who had always belonged. David Sterling walked beside her, saying nothing, but his eyes gleamed with something unshakable. Pride. Cassie didn't need to win. She had already won the moment she no longer needed to prove anything at all. Cassie walked down the aisle of the business class cabin, her presence as composed as ever. There were no more scrutinizing glances, no more quiet doubts. She took her seat, not because someone allowed her to, but because she belonged here. David. Sterling settled into the seat beside her. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone said enough. Across the cabin, Richard Collins had also taken his seat. But something had changed. The business class section of Sterling Airways was bathed in soft, ambient light, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the check-in area earlier. This was a space designed for absolute comfort. Wide leather, seats, generous privacy, crystal glasses filled with golden champagne. Cassie chose a window seat. She reached into her bag, pulled out a book, and flipped it open with a quiet elegance. She looked as if she had never been disturbed at all, as if the confrontation with Richard had been nothing more than a passing breeze. But Richard couldn't forget it so easily. Even as he sat a row away, he was acutely aware of her presence. He tried to focus on the screen in front of him, but her image lingered in the corner of his vision. He took a sip of champagne, but it tasted hollow, flavorless. For the first time in his life, he felt as though the power he had always carried wasn't taken from him. He had surrendered it himself. Every now and then, he glanced at Cassie, but she remained absorbed in her book, entirely unbothered, as if he didn't exist. And that unsettled him more than any argument ever could. Just as Richard was trying to push the thoughts from his mind, he heard it. The murmurs, soft, quiet, but unmistakable. The other business class passengers, the ones who had always shared his world, were talking about him. Did he really think he could say that and no one would notice? A middle-aged woman with silver blonde hair sat with her arms crossed, her voice low. Not loud enough to confront him directly, but loud enough to be heard. Unbelievable, a businessman in glasses murmured, shaking his head in quiet disapproval. Absolutely disgraceful. A relic, a young investor muttered into his glass of whiskey, throwing Richard a quick, dismissive glance, as if he were nothing more than a remnant of a world that no longer existed. Richard gripped the armrest, trying to block it out. But he heard everything. This wasn't over. Even after taking his seat, the judgment still clung to him. He had always been at home in cabins like this, always the one receiving the special treatment, the silent deference. But for the first time, he felt like an outsider among the very people he had once seen as his equals. A young flight attendant, graceful and poised, approached with a polished, yet genuine smile. "Mr. Collins, is everything all right? You seem a bit unsettled. Is there anything I can do for you?" Richard blinked, startled. He had been so caught up in his own thoughts that he hadn't even noticed her standing there. He hesitated before answering. No, I'm fine," he muttered, his voice rougher than he intended. The flight attendant studied him for a brief moment. Then, ever so subtly, her gaze flickered toward Cassie, as if sensing the unspoken tension in the air. And then, with quiet poise, she smiled again. Her voice was gentle, but there was no mistaking her intent. "It's a good thing the industry is changing, don't you think? We're working hard to make sure all passengers receive the same level of respect." Richard froze. She didn't wait for an answer. She simply gave him a polite nod and walked away. But her words echoed in his head, clear as a ringing bell. The industry is changing. The world is changing. The things Richard had always taken for granted, the things he had believed were set in stone, were no longer unquestioned truths. The way things had always been wasn't the way things would always be. Richard stared down at the champagne glass in his hand, watching the bubbles rise to the surface. For the first time, he didn't feel like the man who dictated the rules. For the first time, he questioned himself. Cassie, meanwhile, turned another page in her book, entirely at peace. She didn't need to glance at Richard to know what was happening inside his mind. She had seen this before, too many times. She knew a man like Richard Collins wouldn't shed his beliefs overnight. But something had cracked, and sometimes a single crack is all it takes to break apart a stone that once seemed unshakable. The plane touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, marking the end of a long journey, but the beginning of a shift too subtle to name. Cassie calmly gathered her book and handbag, moving with the same quiet grace she had carried throughout the flight. Richard Collins remained seated. He wasn't ready to stand up just yet. For the past few hours, he had tried to push away the thoughts clawing at the edges of his mind. But it was useless. Every whispered conversation, every side glance, and, most of all, Cassie's words at the check-in counter. They echoed in his head, refusing to fade. Now, as the plane came to a full stop and passengers began filing out, the business class cabin felt eerily empty. Cassie rose first, stepping into the aisle with the same measured poise as before. Richard drew in a slow breath, then finally stood, but his steps felt heavier than they ever had. At the baggage carousel, passengers gathered in small clusters, waiting for their luggage to emerge. The atmosphere here was different, no longer steeped in luxury, but grounded, ordinary. Conversations drifted lazily. The rhythmic hum of the conveyor belt filled the air. Wheels clattered against the floor as suitcases tumbled onto the carousel one by one. Cassie stood with her hands lightly clasped in front of her, watching the baggage belt turn. Her expression was peaceful, unchanged. A few feet away, Richard Collins stood as well. But something was different. Gone was the commanding posture of a man who had always been certain of his place in the world. For the first time in a very long time. Richard hesitated. He had spent his entire career knowing what to say, how to negotiate, how to control the narrative. But now, he felt like a man lost in a conversation with himself. Cassie didn't look at him. She gave no indication that she was waiting for him to speak, and somehow, that made it harder. After a few moments of silent war within himself, Richard finally took a step forward. Cassie didn't turn, but she felt his presence. He cleared his throat, hesitant, uncertain. "Mrs. Bennett." He paused. His voice was quieter, now, less assured. I'm not a racist. I've donated to several charities for Black communities." The moment the words left his mouth, Richard knew they weren't right. Even he wasn't sure what they were supposed to mean in this moment. For the first time, the usual excuses felt hollow. Cassie turned to face him. Her eyes held no anger, no resentment, only clarity. She didn't interrupt. She let him hear himself, let him sit with the weight of his own words, until even he realized they had no meaning. And then, her voice came, soft, steady, yet heavier than any condemnation. "If you're not racist, then why did you assume I couldn't sit there?" Richard froze. The question hung between them, heavy and unshakable, and it didn't need an answer, because he had none. He couldn't say, "I don't know." He couldn't say, "I didn't mean to." And he certainly couldn't say, "It was just a misunderstanding." His throat tightened. For the first time all day, he had no words. Every justification he had rehearsed in his head, every argument he had told himself to cling to, they all crumbled in the face of that single question. Cassie didn't push him for an answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply turned back to the carousel, as if the conversation had never happened. A few moments later, her suitcase slid onto the belt. She reached for it, gripping the handle firmly, and walked away without another word. Richard remained standing, watching her disappear into the crowd. No one told him he was wrong. No one needed to, because he had done that to himself. And that was the heaviest weight of all. The carousel kept turning. Another suitcase tumbled onto the belt. But Richard didn't move to grab his, he was thinking, not angry, not defensive, just thinking. For the first time, he wasn't just hearing conversations about race, he was feeling it. Deep inside himself, in places he had never examined before. For the first time, he understood. Racism wasn't just about slurs or outrage. It lived in the smallest, quietest assumptions, ones he had never even noticed. And for the first time, Richard Collins didn't feel like the man in control. Cassie never needed to win, because she had never been losing. After the brief but weighty conversation at baggage claim, Cassie had walked away, carrying herself with the same quiet grace as always. She left Richard standing there, lost in his own thoughts. The pride of a successful man had been shaken in a way he had never anticipated. His apology had not been rejected, but it had not been easily accepted either. And that was why he couldn't dismiss it as just an awkward moment to forget. For the first time in his life, Richard couldn't simply move on, as if he had done nothing wrong. Weeks later, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the windows of a small but well-kept office. Posters promoting equal educational opportunities lined the walls. Shelves were stacked with books and study materials, alongside framed photographs of smiling students, black and brown faces filled with hope and determination. This was where Cassie had spent most of her life creating real change. A nonprofit organization dedicated to helping underprivileged students access a better education. Today, she sat in her office, turning the pages of a book slowly, savoring the quiet moment of peace. The door opened gently. A young employee stepped in, holding a folder. "Mrs. Bennett," the woman said, her tone hesitant. Cassie looked up, calm but curious at the uncertainty in the young woman's voice. The employee approached, placed the folder on the desk, and slid a document forward. "We just received a large donation," she said, "from someone named Richard Collins." Cassie's gaze dropped to the paper, skimming over the numbers. It was a substantial amount, enough to change the lives of dozens, maybe even hundreds, of students. But what caught her attention was not the money. It was the name, Richard Collins. The same man who had once questioned her place in business class had now contributed to the very cause she had spent her life fighting for. Cassie didn't react right away. She simply stared at the name for a long moment, as if trying to understand what had truly changed inside him. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was recognition. She set the paper down, her expression softening, just slightly. Another employee spoke up, curiosity in her voice. "Would you like to send a thank you message?" Cassie smiled faintly. Not a smile of victory, a smile of understanding. "No," she said simply. She didn't need to say anything. The world didn't change overnight, but sometimes the smallest shifts were the ones that mattered most. In a high-rise office with glass walls reflecting the fading sunlight, Richard Collins stood alone. His desk was immaculate. His computer screen glowed softly, open to documents he hadn't read. But his eyes weren't on his work. They were fixed on a framed portrait hanging on the wall. Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader's gaze seemed to look right at him, a quiet, inescapable reminder. Richard exhaled, but this time, it wasn't a sigh of frustration or defeat. It was a breath of reflection. There was no phone call from Cassie, no thank you letter, no public acknowledgement of his donation, and he didn't need one. He hadn't done it to be forgiven. He had done it because he had finally seen something he had never seen before. For the first time in his life, Richard Collins didn't feel like the main character of the story. And sometimes, that was the most important realization of all. Thank you for being part of this journey. We've witnessed a moment where silence spoke louder than 1,000 justifications, where dignity didn't need to be argued, because it stood on its own. This isn't just a story about fairness. It's about awareness. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly? Would you choose to stay silent? Or would you speak up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to spread the message and subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. The world only changes when people dare to look within themselves. Let's be part of that change, together.